Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Academy for Teachers Masterclass on Othello, the Moor story with Stephen Greenblatt. I'm Daniel Moses, and I teach English at Hunter College High School. I've taught Shakespeare college and high school kids for the past 22 years. I love teaching 16th century texts because I get to see the strangeness of that world along with the students. I'm also a fellow of the Academy for Teachers, an organization that is the only one I know of that creates these sorts of connections between scholars and K through 12 teachers. I have the honor of introducing Stephen Greenblatt. I think everybody here knows who this is. For the record, he teaches at Harvard. He is an editor of the Norton Anthology of English Literature and the Norton Shakespeare, and he wrote Will in the World, and he wrote a bunch of other important books. I've been stealing his ideas, such as the circulation of social energy and Renaissance self-fashioning, as a teacher for so long now that I've come to think of them as my own, but sometimes I do remember to attribute them to Professor Greenblatt. I find his writing of great comfort because it has such skepticism and humility about what one can know of the past. This humility has been of great use to me as a teacher, and I thank him for modeling it. We could all use some magical ability to deal with uncertainty right about now. It is my honor also to introduce the 20 teachers here today who were selected from many applicants. Woohoo! We teach a variety of courses from AP Lit to English as a new language. I don't know if you all are getting paid to do kids, but you're advising a lot of them, including school newspaper, Lit Mag, Honor Society, Social Justice Club, School of Rock, and even the lacrosse team. I also wanted to notice some of the common themes in what we wrote about teaching Shakespeare and Othello in particular. Many spoke of the challenges of keeping students with diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds focused and engaged. Leslie echoed others when she wrote that students might not think a long dead white guy could be relevant. On the other hand, Sean uses race specifically to interest students, and I think many of us do. Anne said that the jealousy thing gets to the kids. Shayna flips the language issue for kids by throwing their slang back at them, making them sound to me like Shakespeare's clowns. And I wanted to read something that Dara Winkler wrote that many of us can relate to. Teaching Othello during the pandemic has been a challenge. And usually I have students sit in a circle, look into one another's eyes and hurl Shakespearean insults. Now I am looking at a screen with 34 avatars in a chat box. I'm sure we will get help from one another today and next week since there's a lot of teaching experience here. We've been in the classroom between 4 and 35 years. The total number of years we've been teaching is 331. We teach between 30 and 201 kids each. The number of children who know our names is 2,266 this year. So your real audience today, Professor Greenblatt, are those 2,266 kids. Thank you for being here. And thanks also to my fellow teachers for teaching. And with that, shall we begin?
Thank you so much, Danny. I was nervous already, and now I'm more nervous thinking that there's 2,000 people or more out there. And I'm also grateful. I'm grateful for something that you've alluded to already, though without knowing it. I'm a scholar of Shakespeare, such as I am, really because of a high school course taught by now a man named John Harris, who's now gone, but who had an enormous impact on me. Was a wonderful, wonderful teacher. But what I most remember about the class, which was a wonderful Newton High School in Massachusetts class, really a sort of deep experience for me, was a moment at which he who seemed to know everything in the way that really good high school teachers seem uncannily to know everything. We were reading King Lear, and he said he had thought about this a lot and he didn't understand what was being said at all. And that startled me has stayed with me. I'm an old guy now, but it stayed with me for more than a half century. And the power and meaning of that has stayed with me and has, to some extent, conditioned my whole life. So I have a lot to learn from you. I'm not sure you have all that much to learn from me. And what I have to learn from you has everything to do with what you've written about and what you know already, which is that Othello is at once the perfect play for our moment, the perfect Shakespeare play, if you're going to read a Shakespeare play at all. And at the same time, it's the most fraught, troubled of all the Shakespeare plays, maybe along with Merchant of Venice, because which is also, as you know, and you may have taught it many times, widely taught in high school, because it raises so many hot button issues, and because it doesn't belong to our world, because it, as you've already, in our little breakout room, we've already begun to talk about the fact that it is about race and it isn't about race. It's a fantastically difficult play to get in focus in relation to the issues that torment us. At the same time, it's directly about those issues. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. What I'm going to do is to share the screen for a few minutes, then I'm going to stop. I'm going to keep track of my time if I can, and we can chat, and then I will stop again. I say that because when I share the screen, I may not be able to see you if you have a hand raised. So if you then just make a note of a question, that if you have it, we will go from there. We can take it up when we chat about it. Let's see if this actually works. All right. Sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. Do you see me? Oops. I don't see myself in the screen, strangely enough. Actually, hang on a second. Let me try again. Let me see if I can stop this. I should know how to do this technically, and I do know how to do this, but for some reason, my computer didn't cooperate just now. So forgive me. Let me just go back out. All right. Let me pause this. I hope this never happens to you, but it's very annoying when it happens. Let me try again. I see what I did. I go to advanced. Now I'll use slides as virtual background.
It was working when you did it last time.
Yeah, it was working, but it didn't. It didn't allow me to be on the screen at the same time. So let's just try.
I saw you. I saw
you.
you.
You did see me? I couldn't see myself. All right. So I am going to. I'm feeling extremely annoyed. And if I can't do this right now, I'm going to stop and just, here we go. All right, let's try this. All right, can you see me? Good.
Yes.
That looks perfect.
All right, thank you. So this is John. Now I'm going to even do this so you can, aha, look at that. So this is John Coney playing Othello in a famous production in South Africa in Johannesburg in the 70s that was a kind of provocation against the apartheid regime by Janet Suzman, worth mentioning because one of the issues that I'm sure comes up in your classes and certainly comes up with mine is the extent to which Othello, whose attitudes toward race are by no means unambiguous, is a racist play by an old dead white guy. And the answer is not simply no, of course not, but it's a complicated play about racial issues. And it is a play that has had a long, rich history of production, one piece of which in our own world, at least in a production like this in South Africa, is a play that's been very important in the struggle for human rights and specifically for the rights of Black people here in South Africa. It is a play, as you may know already, that is in two texts, and this is the kind of thing that people like me fool around with a lot. There's a quarto text. This is the title page from the quarto, which was published after this, a little like paperback version of the play these were sometimes sold actually during the productions themselves. This was performed both in the public theater of the Globe, the outdoor theater, and in Blackfriars, Shakespeare's more expensive private theater. And this came out after his death, but a year before the publication of the famous first folio, where there's a different text of Othello. And they're both called Othello, the Moor of Venice, and there are some, and the texts are fundamentally the same, but there are a few interesting variations that one can talk about in one's classes, and I'll come to one of these at the very end. What I just want you to notice here is that subtitle in both plays, the Moor of Venice, because the Moor of Venice is a little bit like whatever, the rabbi of the Vatican. There's something a little bit tricky about Moor and Venice together, and they would have grasped that there was something tricky about the two terms together. And indeed, a lot of the play is about pulling the Moor and Venice apart, as you know. So a few very quick things to say. First of all, why Venice? Shakespeare wrote two plays about Venice, this one and The Merchant of Venice, and they're both engaged with very similar issues which have to do with strangers or outsiders in a white Christian world. And why Venice? Because Venice was the most cosmopolitan city of Europe at the time, and famous for its sophistication, for its cultural mixing, for the fact that it wasn't all one thing, and lots of people mixed together. And we get a funny moment at the beginning of Othello. And in Othello, there's lots of kind of strange comic moments, which we could talk about formally a little bit if we have time. And play is in some ways it's unbearably painful tragedy. It's a little bit structured as a comedy. But Brabantio, Desdemona's father, says at the beginning, "This is Venice. My house is not a grange. I don't live on some farm somewhere. This is Venice." And Venice is the place in which people feel secure and stable and also comfortable in mixing with other peoples. And indeed, if you look at the things that Shakespeare could have read that were being read in the 16th century about Venice, you get an emphasis on the fact that some foreign men and strangers, as Contarini writes, have been adopted into the number of citizens in Venice, either in regard of their great nobility or that they'd been dutiful toward the state. They had done some duty to the state, or else had done unto them some notable service. They had done unto them some notable service. And you might just notice that phrase. And why the Moor of Venice? If you go to Venice, as you can glimpse up on the lots of buildings, this is just a picture snapped on the street, of pictures of Moors on buildings, either from people who actually were living there or there's a lot of mixing, a lot of interest in Moors and in foreigners in general. Why the Moor of Venice? Because Othello says, "I've done the state some service," and they know it. That's the nature of Venice, is to incorporate into its life people who've done the state some service. Okay, the setting of the play, again, as you will know, those of you who've taught the play, is in a time of conflict between the Ottoman Empire, which is pictured here in orange, and the Christian countries of Europe. The Ottoman Empire is absolutely vast, as you can see. And Venice had a crucial role in all of this. Your students won't be, I know, fantastically interested in the ins and outs of this, but Venice had a crucial role in this culture struggle between the Christian West and the Muslim East. Though to call it the Muslim East is actually comical if you look at that map, because it's not just the East. But you will see that Cyprus is in a location, a very strategic location, and Venice was holding on to Cyprus. The Christians were holding on to Cyprus as a crucial location in the very heart of the of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so more to say about that, but I'll just move on to say that Europe European Christianity had a long history of interactions with Moors and Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, and the images were by no means always negative or hostile. There's lots to say about Leo Africanus's life and text. The text I showed you, a tiny piece of. He's an astonishing character, Leo Africanus. He was a Muslim who was kidnapped, captured by the Christians, taken as a prisoner to Rome. He converted to Christianity. His godfather was the Pope. He was given a new name. His name was Al-Hazan al-Wazan, but he took on the name of Leo the African, Leo Africanus. And then he wrote at papal request this long, extraordinary account of Africa, where he had traveled enormously widely. He was from a family that did trade and had diplomatic relations, so he knew Africa very well, insofar as people could know Africa as a gigantic continent. He had actually seen quite a lot of it, so he wrote this account. And the account itself is extremely interesting, and as we already noticed in our little breakout room, is ambiguous about the nature of Africans and about Moors. And then toward the latter part of his life, he actually managed to go back to North Africa from where he was kidnapped, and he converted back to Islam. So he's a kind of boundary crosser all his life, a very complicated figure. There's a brilliant biography of him by Natalie Zeman Davis called Trickster Travels, that if you're curious about it, you might want to read. Anyway, the Europeans already had an account, in this case of an ancient medieval account of African allies, Black allies, and this exemplified in the figure of St. Maurice, who was understood from very early on, as here in this German representation, to be an African, who was a fighter, a warrior on behalf of Christianity, and a martyr, actually. And there are many, many images of St. Maurice all through medieval and Renaissance art. And as they say, they're not images in which Blacks are treated with a lack of respect. They're honored and admired. Also, as in this Cranach the Elder from closer to Shakespeare's time from the 16th century, but there are many such images of St. Maurice here dressed in more fanciful Renaissance courtier warrior style. Okay, at the same time, and in fact, the Cranach, that image of the Cranach picks up something that I think Beth Bosworth and our little group talked about, which was the strange grandeur and music in Othello's voice always. Othello is an unbelievable figure in the play. He sounds different from all of the other characters in the play, with an extravagant rhetoric. I do agonize a natural and prompt alacrity I find in hardness, he says. Agonize? And so forth. I mean, he's always using extravagant language and with a beautiful rhythmical force, and that's part of what gives him his power. There's a special Othello music that distinguishes him. But if he's a Christian warrior, he's the prop of the Venetian state. His enemies are Muslim, and we come against another different association with the word with Moors. Here's the Moorish ambassador to London in the year 1600, Abd al-Wahid bin Masud bin Muhammad al-Anuri, who came to London in 1600 to try to negotiate an agreement with Queen Elizabeth to do a kind of pincer movement against the Turks. Didn't work out, but he caused a sensation when he appeared in his Moorish costume. And here, as you can see, he was painted by an English painter. And it's possible that figure Shakespeare was at work in London at the time would have been a figure he would have seen and might have thought about in this context. Othello says at one point in the play, "We turn Turks, and to ourselves do that which heaven hath forbid the Ottomites, for Christian shame put by this barbarous brawl." Othello may have come from that world, the Moorish world, but he's decidedly, intensely, and very repeatedly marked off as a Christian, as a convert to Christianity. In any case, he has, as it's possible to have, whether he's a North African or a Sub-Saharan African, he could be represented with considerable dignity. He's not a character, not a character of mockery. He's not an outsider in the way, even a tragic outsider in the way that Shylock is in The Merchant of Venice. He has much more grandeur and dignity in the context of the play. At the same time, he is subject to, and the play has, as you know, and that's something you deal with, and I'm sure you've dealt with it repeatedly, and I'm very interested in what you do with it, racist language, racist imagery attached to him. What a full fortune does the thick lips owe if he can carry it thus. But the simplest thing to say, I think, doesn't settle everything, but the simplest thing to say is that that's said by Rodrigo, who's a scumbag in the play, and likewise, even now, very now, an old black ram is topping your white ewe. That's said by Iago, who's a bigger scumbag in the play. And that is to say, the most racist language, if racist is the right word, and again, in our little group, and you will have explored this yourself, race, this is a play written before racism in our sense, the quasi-scientific sense, though, as it was formulated in the late 18th and 19th century, existed. And you can just see the concept in a very strange, evasive, fluid way, just being sort of played with, formulated, not fully developed. And there's an enormous amount of work being done in my field now about this subject of race before race, of how race is here being used, how race in any of these places is being used. It's valuable and useful because we all get it, that the whole concept of race as we use it is a total fraud, is a mess, is a lie, is an absurdity. That doesn't correspond to anything except it corresponds to a lot in the behaviors of society, but it doesn't have the quasi-scientific reality that it had for the 19th and for the 20th century, for the early 20th century. And it didn't have that actually for the 16th century, early 17th century either. It had something more fluid and amorphous and troubled. Well, we can go back to that. Very quickly before I take, as they say, a break, the play was written for a white actor in blackface. First, Othello was Richard Burbage, who was the great lead tragic actor in Shakespeare's company, who played Hamlet and lots of the other great male parts in the tragedies. And it was played by a succession of white actors. It was played for an all-male, all-white company in Shakespeare's time. And in fact, in 1964, when I was a student in Cambridge, in England, I went actually twice because I was so fascinated by it. I went twice to London to see this man, Laurence Olivier, perform the part in blackface for the National Theatre in London. It was an extremely uncomfortable experience and very complicated experience, although now, I mean, blackface performances are now being experimented with in complicated ways, as are whiteface performances. It's a but in 1964, this was the last possible moment, I think, for that kind of blackface performance by a very great actor, but whose miming of racial difference was fantastically uncomfortable. And that performance came in the wake of a small number, but an important number of performances of the part by Black actors. The first great one was Ira Aldrich, son of an American slave, a great actor who couldn't perform the part in the United States because of racism in the 19th century, but went to England and actually traveled through Europe and had a huge success in Poland and Russia playing Othello. And it's actually buried in Poland, Ira Aldrich, who's a tremendously interesting and daring actor. And he, at the end of the performances that he did in the 19th century, he gave abolitionist speeches, anti-slavery speeches from the stage. And then there's another famous performance by Paul Robeson, maybe the most famous Othello of the 20th century. This was the longest running play on Broadway in the 20th century, Robeson's Othello, that also traveled in the country in the 1940s. Robeson was an activist and a human rights activist and a civil rights activist, and refused to perform before segregated audiences. So the play traveled very widely. We have very interesting records of his refusal to perform in segregated venues. Okay, that is where I'll stop for a moment, or at least for a few moments, just to break the monotony of hearing me speak, and let's just talk for a few minutes about how you handle and questions that you might have, and how you handle the representation of the racial issues in the play, because that must be, in a way, item number one in virtually anyone's classroom at this point.
Maxime, you have your hand up. Go ahead and jump in.
Well, I didn't see
I had more of a question. I'm curious, especially since the Cynthia text is supposed to be, I guess, an influence for Shakespeare, but I don't find that race is as much of an issue in the Cynthia text, especially for the ensign's hatred, as it is in Shakespeare's text with Iago. I find that Iago, or the ensign in the text, seems to like Othello. And while he's the villain, there is still a friendship or an admiration that's there. While in Othello, it's clear that Iago has a hatred for Othello, and I characterize it as rooted in just his hatred for what Othello stands for, and obviously in the beginning he highlights the fact that he wasn't promoted. So I'm curious to see where Shakespeare gets, or why does he incorporate race so heavily, more so than the Cynthia text?
Yeah, it's a tremendously good question, and one to which I have no very good answer, except to say, first of all, you're absolutely right. What's very striking about the Gerard di Cintio tale is, though he describes him as un capitano moro, a Moorish captain, he makes nothing of it. There's virtually nothing in the story that is specifically related to his being a Moor. And we actually don't, no one knows why Shakespeare did this, except to say, first of all, overall, that there's something uncanny about Shakespeare. I say, as someone who's in the business, as it were, I've been in the business all my life, that why does he do this? Why does he decide that anxiety and hatred about Black people, or anxiety and hatred of Jews, or anxiety and hatred of uppity women should be a subject of these plays? He takes these texts, and or in the case of the Tempest, he takes the New World native. He takes these characters and he blows them up. He enters them in a way that they never are blown up or entered into in his source texts. It's as if he has a kind of eerie, uncanny instinct for what is going to cause trouble, as it were, what is causing trouble in the psyche of his world, in the psyche of the world that's to come for centuries. It's if he senses where there's going to be some problem. And of course, in the case of Othello, I mean, as you've already said, there's layer upon layer. Othello is someone just filled with ressentiment, with hatred of the fact that he's been passed over, as he feels, or resentful for being a mere servant to a much more important person, and race hatred. As if Iago was inventing it. I say Othello, as if Iago were kind of inventing racism as he's going along, as it were, to find as much as he can to loathe the person he wants to destroy. And the odd thing about the destruction, Maxime, as you know from the source, is Iago doesn't set out, the ensign doesn't set out in the Cintio source to destroy Othello, the captain, at all. But it becomes a kind of obsession in the case of Iago, although it makes no sense, typically. It makes no sense, typically, it's a typical Shakespeare trick. Iago says he wants to become the lieutenant, and he does become the lieutenant. And his wife is working for Mrs. Othello. So it makes no sense to destroy Mr. and Mrs. Othello. They're out of a job if they do, but he can't stop. He keeps going and he keeps going and he keeps going. So your question is a deep one. I don't have, an answer per se. I think the idea of hatred, the kind of hatred that drives people to do really insane things. I wrote about the play in a different context once about Iago as a kind of suicide bomber, the kind of person who's so filled with hatred that he's actually willing to blow himself up in order to get the thing that he wants to destroy. This is quite unlike Shylock, who is given the chance to kill his enemy, but he backs off because he doesn't want to be killed for it. But Iago, it makes no sense for Iago to do what he's doing, but he does it out of a kind of an anger, a resentment. And listen, guys, we live in a country in which there are a lot of people who are just filled with incredible amounts of resentment and anger that they take out in ways that are actually self-destructive, but they take out anyway because however they do it, at the ballot box or in other ways, they do things that don't make any sense, but they do it anyway as an expression of this feeling of anger, resentment that they have. And Iago is one of Shakespeare's most astonishing inventions that way, but working through Othello's skin color.
But I find it frustrating that it's so easy to manipulate someone that they lifted up to be a general and somebody who's filled with strength. So I always relate that to race, that Othello is so easily manipulated. Like I think obviously the focus of jealousy having so much power over one being, but I also just focus on his weakness, because the ability for Iago to take him down so masterfully is very telling to what I believe Shakespeare's intent was in involving race for me.
You could certainly argue this, and people have argued this, and it completely makes sense to me. The argument makes sense to me, though I don't agree with it. There is the Italian filmmaker Pasolini, who some of you may know, made a kind of a parody of Othello called something like "What Are the Clouds Called?" in which it's just Othello and Iago, and they're puppets, Sicilian puppets. And the point about Pasolini's point about Othello is exactly yours. He's an idiot. He's an idiot. And indeed, even within the play, there's that incredible moment in which Emilia, finally, too late, says, "Don't, idiot," the thing that we've been wanting to say the whole time. Why are you listening to this? But I would say two things in mitigation of. So you could easily argue that Othello is vulnerable as an outsider, maybe, as someone who finally however much he thinks he's part of Venetian society, really doesn't understand how it works. He doesn't really understand how vulnerable he really is. So that's possible. And maybe you could even say it's a kind of parodic version of what an ignorant outsider is. But what I want to call your attention to is that what you could call your students' attention to, if you want, is that when in the famous scene, Act 3, Scene 3, in which Iago is pouring the poison into Othello, Othello says, if you were a villain, this is exactly the kind of thing you would be saying to me. You remember that moment, Maxime? He says, he gets it. He gets that this is exactly what a villain would do who was trying to screw him. But he says, I know you're honest. He trusts him as another human being. So you could say that it's all too easy, but we trust our friends. We trust the people we've worked with all our lives. We rely on them, and we make fatal mistakes because of that. But that's not, I don't think that could be necessarily attributed to naivete or innocence or stupidity. It's a kind of fundamental trust, which Iago sees in Othello from the beginning. He says he's of an open nature and takes advantage of it. I want to, I think, is there, are there other questions?
I was going to say,
Yeah,
Adam, I wonder if you want to jump in.
I would like to. Thank you.
Thank you.
So in response to Maxime's question, which was an excellent question, thank you for asking that and answering. You mentioned that Shakespeare had a knack for understanding what would cause trouble, I believe was your phrase. And it seemed to me that resonates with the more contemporary concept of agitation as a form of pushing for civil rights. And the way that I've always addressed Shakespeare's treatment of race, but also religion and colonialism with students is that Shakespeare, for me, is a civil rights oriented artist. And he's using this concept of, in order to have critical conversations about these topics in our world, we need to kind of present the ugly face of these tropes and of these ideas. That way audiences can reckon with the human that he, characterizes and the tragedy they feel when they witness his or her eventual downfall.
I think it's a powerful and interesting way to imagine what Shakespeare is for us. And I think I agree with you completely. The qualification I would say is that Shakespeare is also a pre-Enlightenment writer. That is to say, Shakespeare is writing precisely before the whole notion of rights in the Enlightenment sense from Locke on was formulated. So it's one of the things, I think it actually is one of the sources of fascination and power of these plays, that characters like Shylock or Othello or Caliban in The Tempest are represented in ways that make me very uncomfortable, because they're not, how should we say, they're not made by someone who has the same attitude toward representing otherness that we after the Enlightenment have. And yet Shakespeare, in a way, heroically, seeing, as it were, even not grasping a notion of rights, finds a way to burrow down into what a human being is and needs and wants and deserves. And what a tragedy it is not to have that. It would be as if, because Shakespeare is writing in not in a democratic culture, not in a enlightened culture. A culture that's full of things that we wouldn't tolerate for a minute. When Shakespeare walks to the theater, he sees bodies hanging up on the scaffolds, and it's if you picture Shakespeare writing, as I think these plays are written, in something like contemporary Saudi Arabia or Iran or the old Soviet Union, you get more of an idea of what it was to write these plays in that world and to come to the place that he comes to, which is the place that I think you're right completely, Adam, that we could take as activists and use. I want to share the screen and I'll go through it briefly again, but as a way of raising a second set of issues. If I can figure out once again how to do it. There we go. Okay, just quickly, this is image of Adrian Lester and Rory Kinner in the 2013 National Theatre production of Othello, which is available. There's a link I think you can probably get through your libraries to this production, which is a very good one of Othello. What I want to turn attention to in this second part is a different set of issues, not about race, actually, but via, or not strictly about race, but via Toni Morrison's Desdemona. Some of you may know Morrison's work, and actually, I think you could very effectively teach it in your classes. It's a very, very short play with music that she wrote for a production in Vienna in 2011. But Morrison's emphasis in what she sees in the play is not, there's some very interesting reflections on race, but not only race. She has her Desdemona, who's dead in her play, the ghost of Desdemona speaking, in effect. My husband knew Iago was lying, manipulating, sabotaging. So why did he act on an obvious deceit? Back to Maxime's question. Brotherhood. The language of love is trivial compared to the hidden language of men, she says. And there is, as you also will, I'm sure, have noticed, a strong proto-feminist and also activist, in Adam's sense, undertone in the play. It is expressed obviously by Emilia very powerfully, talks about her husband turning the seamy side without, but also Desdemona, these men. And even Bianca saying, I'm no strumpet, Bianca, who's accused of being a whore, or may not be a sex worker. And that notion of turning the seamy side out calls your attention to, and again, if you're doing this in 8th grade or 9th grade, how much time you can spend at all on the language of the play is not clear because it's difficult language. But if you look at language like Iago's, when he's talking about his plot to destroy Othello, it is engendered. Hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light. Engendered, bringing it a birth to the light. Or my invention comes from my pate, my brain, as birdlime does from frieze. It plucks out brains and all, but my muse labors, and thus she's delivered. You can, if you want, take time to explore the perversity, the sexual pathology that is in the male language of the play. It's one of Shakespeare's strangest inventions in Othello. And the more you look at the play from that angle, the more you see, and it becomes stranger and stranger. We could tease out why that image of the bird line coming out of frieze would be, but I won't take the time to do it now. And Othello, part of the force of the play, part of the tragedy of the play is that Othello, who doesn't use that language consistently, by the end is using it himself a lot. Thy bed, lust stained, he says to Desdemona, shall with lust's blood be spotted. So Shakespeare, this is the only play I think of Shakespeare in which there's a reference to spots on the sheets, spots from sex on the sheets, or describing Iago, an honest man he is, and hates the slime that sticks on filthy deeds. If, as they say, you guys are teaching junior high school and high school, I don't know how much you want to get in, go to this place, but if you want to, it's all there. This is an extraordinary play about exploring pathological male anxieties about sex, and about the consequences of male pathology. Are you not a strumpet? Othello says to Desdemona. No, as I'm a Christian, she says, if to preserve this vessel for my lord from any other foul, unlawful touch be not to be a strumpet, I'm none. What, not a whore? And again, you could talk if you want about the language of the vessel, the woman is a Christian vessel, which an unspotted vessel, which Desdemona at this point takes on for herself to try to defend herself against Othello's disgusting accusation. Okay, there's much more to say about this, but I want to say a few words. We've already said a few words in our group and also here about Cintio, that amazing source. And we've already said via Maxime that the wicked ensign, disregarding the word he had given his wife and the friendship, loyalty, and obligations he owed the Moor, fell passionately in love with Desdemona. So one of the remarkable things that Shakespeare does, and this is actually, since the Cintio story is very short and the kids can all read it, one thing that's fascinating about it is to see what Shakespeare does, which is to throw away the motive that makes sense of the whole damn thing. And that's actually typical of Shakespeare's technique. As a playwright, he tries to identify what the motive in his principal motive in his source was, and he almost invariably discards it. So he discards it and leaves you with a problem. Why is Iago doing this? In Cintio, everything he tried in order to make her fall in love with him had as little effect as if he hadn't tried anything at all. The love he felt for the lady changed to hatred, and he concentrated all his efforts into working out how he could, should he fail to conquer the lady, prevent the Moor from enjoying her favors. All right, that's what he is up to. It's particularly offensive to him that she doesn't even notice that he's trying to seduce her. She's that uninterested in him, and of course he wants to therefore destroy her, not to destroy. He doesn't set out to destroy him. The absence of that creates a famous problem in the play, which is why the hell is Iago doing this? And it's a question that's asked finally and directly at the end of the play. Will you, I pray, demand that demi-devil why he hath thus ensnared my soul and body? And Iago famously says, I'm not going to say anything. Demand me nothing. What you know. From this time forth, I never will speak word. And he doesn't say anything else. And this has spawned a sort of quite a large minor industry trying to figure out why Iago is doing what he's doing. And you'll have various ideas and we can talk about it more. The way he does it principally focuses on this strange object, the handkerchief. And that's another great focus for the play, but also a focus, as we'll see, that connects Iago's technique with the male sexual pathology that, as they say, runs through the play. In the Cintio source, as you know, there's a weird thing that interesting thing that Shakespeare throws out, that Iago and his wife have a daughter. And it's interesting to think about why that would completely disrupt our sense of Iago and Emilia if we thought that they had a child. But in the source, they have a child. He had a 3-year-old daughter who was much loved by Desdemona, so he took the child in his arms one day when the wretched lady had gone to the rascal's house and placed her in the arms of the lady, he being the Iago figure, who drew her to her bosom. This deceitful scoundrel, who was very deft with his fingers, very carefully took the handkerchief out of her belt without her noticing anything. That's how he gets the handkerchief. But Shakespeare has this very different invention for how he gets how Iago gets his hands on the handkerchief. In the late 17th century, there's a completely fascinating attack on Othello by someone named Thomas Reimer, who hates the handkerchief. Says, you can't have a tragedy that's about a handkerchief. Why don't they just call it the tragedy of the handkerchief? It's completely ridiculous to have a play built around a handkerchief. It's an object that's way, way beneath the dignity of a tragedy. But Shakespeare has decided to make the handkerchief weirdly central in the play. Iago, in the Great Temptation scene, you'll remember, says, tell me but this, have you not sometimes seen a handkerchief spotted with strawberries in your wife's hand? And again, you can do something with spotted with strawberries if you want. I mean, that goes with the other references to spotting that is part of I think, kind of anxiety about male anxiety. I gave her such a one, 'twas my first gift, says Othello, and Iago says, I don't know that. But such a handkerchief, I'm sure it was your wife's, did I today see Cassio wipe his beard with? And again, you can decide how much you want to go there. But the more you look, the more, how should we say, eroticized weirdly eroticized the handkerchief becomes, the more it becomes Desdemona's sexuality, the more it's connected to wiping things, to slimy things, to blowing things as part of this very strange male anxiety. And Desdemona in the play says, when she's trying to get Othello to meet with Cassio, Othello says, "I have a salt and sorry room offends me. Lend me thy handkerchief." He wants to blow his nose, he says. He wants to blow his nose into the handkerchief. Okay. And then Othello gives Desdemona a very complicated account of the handkerchief that you will have all know. It's very unclear whether Othello is making it up or not. Is it possible, Desdemona says? And he says, yes, it's true. There's magic in the web of it. And he has a fantastically elaborate and strange account, which may be true, or he may be making it up in order to frighten Desdemona about the origins of the handkerchief. Okay. One other thing to say about this set of issues. I mean, there's much to say about this set of issues, but Desdemona, unlike the men in the play, Desdemona and Emilia too, the women in the play are unusually frank about sex and don't seem to be uncomfortable about sex. Desdemona says that I did love the Moor to live with him. My downright violence and storm of fortunes made trumpet to the world. My heart subdued even to the very quality of my lord. And in the Cordo text, she says, even to the utmost pleasure of my lord. She's very frank about his pleasure and about her pleasure, and not afraid of it, not afraid of talking about it. And even Cassio, who's also a very complicated piece of work, but Cassio says too, he begins to think about Othello and Desdemona as almost a god and goddess of sexual life. Great Jove, Othello, guard and swell his sail with thine own powerful breath, that he may bless this bay with his tall ship, make love's quick pants in Desdemona's arms. So the sexual relationship between Othello and Desdemona, which is figured here in very transparent metaphors, is very much at the center of the play, but it's the problem of the play. And Othello feels it as a problem in this famous speech, which is so extraordinarily beautiful. Othello has this description of what he's feeling inside, which is this up and down, the Olympus high, ducking low again as hells from heaven. If I were to now die, I'd be most happy. I don't think I can have another moment like this. The intensest erotic moments in the play for Othello, for the men in the play, are moments in which it's almost beyond their being able to stand it. They can't stand it. Whereas Desdemona says, "Oh no, it's going to get only better. Keep going. We'll have more and more pleasure." And it's out of that Iago begins to figure out how he's going to get Othello. Cassio is a proper man. He says, Cassio's good looking. Let me see now, to get his place and to plume up my will in double knavery. How? Let's see. And by the way, Shakespeare, now this is a fairly familiar way of doing it. Shakespeare's inventing this extraordinary way of representing someone improvising. There's nothing anyone else has done before that's quite like this, where you're watching someone, a professional improviser, as it were, a kind of quasi playwright, try to come up with a plot. Let's see how I'll do it. And what he does is come up with the idea that he's going to abuse Othello's ear, that he's too familiar with his wife. This means presumably Cassio is too familiar with his wife, but the peculiarity of the pronouns, he is too familiar with his wife, is deliberate on Shakespeare's part, because what Iago is going to work with is Othello's anxiety about his, that I've been dwelling on, is Othello's anxiety about his sexual desire, about what it means to love Desdemona. And he can play on this, I'm sure you wouldn't get into with your students, but just to tell you that there's a long tradition that goes back to St. Jerome that says that a man can commit adultery with his own wife by having too much sexual pleasure with your wife. If you're too drawn to your wife, if you're too intensely, if you get too much pleasure with your wife. If you show no modesty or comeliness, as Calvin says, it's not just Catholic, it's Protestant as well. If you show no modesty or comeliness in conjugal intercourse, you're committing adultery with your own wife. So if you feel this kind of boundless desire, which Othello has just described, you're committing adultery. So Iago is able to play with this peculiar anxiety that, as I say, deeply rooted psychologically, but also theologically in the play. And Desdemona walks straight into it constantly. Farewell, my Desdemona, I'll come to thee straight. Be as your fancies teach you, she says to Othello. Whate'er you be, I'm obedient. Be as your fancies. She's always saying things like that. Be as your fancies teach you. And in a way, that's the kind of fatal thing to say to it. The very thing she's saying to please Othello is making him more and more anxious. When I love thee not, chaos has come again, he says. And of course, everything is built around Iago's famous indeed. Something that's not actually ever quite said. Indeed, Iago says that indeed is like a knife stuck in Othello. Okay, I will end my little share screen just with a couple of last glimpses. Think on thy sins, Othello says. Desdemona says with more truth than she knows, they're the loves I bear to you. Her love is actually what is causing this tremendous, one of the things that Iago is working with to get him to enrage. Yes, and for that thou diest. And she says that that's unnatural, it kills for loving. But that is actually what's going on at the end. And then the last speech, and this many of you will know that there's a famous crux in the Othello's final speech in which he's working himself up to kill himself. I mean, he's going to kill himself simultaneously as the great Christian warrior and as the enemy that the Christian warrior is killing. He'll be both at the same time. I pray you in your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of them as they are, nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice. Then must you speak of one that loved not wisely but too well, of one not easily jealous but being wrought, perplexed in the extreme, of one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away, richer than all his tribe. And that is the quarto speech, and here's the folio of one whose hand, like the base Judean. They didn't use a J in the Elizabethan printing house. They used that I, which could go in both, like as you can see above, jealous and Judean. Those are both J's. So the question is it Indian or Judean? If it's an Indian, it seems to be referring to those Native Americans who are naive and taken advantage of by the cunning colonists because they didn't really understand. They were just tricked. In the case of the base Judean, it is referring almost certainly to Judas, to the principal, but precisely not naive, but guilty, sinful enemy who throws the pearl away richer than all his tribe. And as you can also probably see from this, the reason this drives people crazy is that the word, basically, the word is spelled the same way. There's an E in one of them and an I, but it's pronounced the same. But the key thing is that letter N. Was this a deliberate change, or was this just the person in the printing house who took the N and put it upside down and made a U out of it? Because an N and a U are the same letter. So it's the kind of thing that keeps me occupied, but it doesn't necessarily going to bother you. But this is all working up to the moment at which Othello will kill himself as a circumcised dog, as the Jew/Muslim enemy of the Christian that he is also wielding the knife to destroy. Okay, I will stop my screen sharing, come back to the group. And if I'm not mistaken, we have at least 5 minutes to
Yes.
take some more questions and your comments. So as you say, race, misogyny, race and sexual anxiety, however you want to put it, they're both out on the table here. You can do with them, as I'm sure you do, what you like. The race is more obvious, but the misogyny is very intense, or the male sexual anxiety is very intense. And you get that fantastic moment in which Emilia says, "Are you kidding me? I'd sleep if you're talking about, let's not get hysterical about female sexuality. I mean, I'd sleep with people if they were willing to give me enough. I mean, and so forth." You get a remarkably frank conversation at the end between Emilia and Desdemona.
Yeah. Miriam, would you like to jump in?
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate hearing from you. Curious if I could ask you what your thoughts are about Ayanna Thompson's research on the mummy-dyed handkerchief and how that sort of helps all of those ideas of race, misogyny, violence, all of those things converge, sexuality converge if the handkerchief is indeed black or dark brown with red spots on it instead of being white.
Yeah, no, it is. First of all, I want to say that Ayanna Thompson was my PhD student. I know her, like her, and admire her and what she's done. And yes, I showed you a white handkerchief with spots on it. I myself think that the white handkerchief in relation to the white sheets is pretty irresistible. And also, but I think that Ayanna Thompson's argument, which is that we don't have to imagine it as a white handkerchief, but it was dyed with mummy, and therefore they used, as Ayanna knows, and as you know, they used actually mummy in medicine and other places all the time. There was a huge mail order shipments of mummies that they were digging up in India, in Egypt, to the Western European countries, because doctors used mummy flesh in expensive medicines. So it's entirely possible. And in any case, even if it's not literally a dark handkerchief, the staining or darkening of the handkerchief, Ayanna's surely right, that the whole story ties together anxiety about the mother, anxiety about transmission from mother to son to wife, fear of female sexuality, anxiety possibly about menstruation. I mean, everything seems to get, I mean, the funny thing about Thomas Reimer, he was actually a rather interesting guy, but he is an idiot. The handkerchief was actually a fantastic invention for Shakespeare, because it, as a way of representing female sexuality, as a way of representing everything from the vagina on through every aspect of what you could possess, protect, pass around in female sexuality. It's an unbelievably brilliant device.
Well, do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Great. Walter, why don't you jump in?
Where I'm looking for Walter. Oh yeah, Walter, you have to unmute yourself. There you are.
Othello a converso?
Is he like Alhazan al-Wazan, who became Leo Africanus?
Yes.
I think he is not a converso myself, or an interesting question. I think he doesn't wish to be. I think he's a good Christian. I think he thinks of himself right up to the end as a Christian. He wants Desdemona to say her prayers when she before he executes justice upon her. But if you mean by that, does Shakespeare imagine, or is the play inviting us to imagine, that there's some part of himself that hasn't actually converted, that is returning to what it was that, let's say, Leo Africanus described the Numidians as like? Yes, it's possible. I think that's a possible reading. I really do think it's possible. I resist it, I confess, because I think it's a racist reading, not your racist reading or my racist reading, but I think it's Iago's racist reading, as it were. of the play. I think that it's what he's trying to do to Othello, the erring barbarian, as he calls him. But I think that for me, the deep tragic irony of the play is that the enemy, the terrible enemy, is not the Moor, the Muslim out there on the frontier. It's your best friend at home. You are the person you most trust at home. And the thing that you have to actually be careful about is not your hidden background or your background as an African. It's the values of your world, in this case, the Christian values of your world that you've embraced and that are actually potentially lethal.
Right.
So that's how I read that. But that's a very, very important and valuable question.
Thank you.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. And I think there is definitely something to be said for leaving them wanting more, but it is also a sad moment when we need to say goodbye. So I would like to take this time to thank you, Professor Greenblatt, for being here and for raising these really rich themes of misogyny and race. And therefore helping these teachers think about how to bring those themes out into their classrooms, and also to thank all of you for being here and being such wonderful, rich participants of this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really my pleasure and my privilege. So I'm grateful to you. Honestly, you're the people who do it. I mean, that I don't have to deal with real issues that you deal with, and I'm hugely admiring of you. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you. And to the teachers, we will see you next week. And to Professor Greenblatt, thank you very much for your time. It really has been wonderful to have you with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Bye. Bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.